Welcome all. So it's very nice that you join us here for this online panel about problem-based learning with the Reflect platform. I'm joined today by Zach Piso, Paul Hirsch, who both used the software in the past. So it's great to get their experience because they know more about how this feels if you try the software for the first time. So the Reflect platform has been developed based on a grant from NSF in their cyber learning program. We started in 2016, and the software is still in its development. So this is still an ongoing project. But now we reached a point where it really makes sense to talk about it because it is possible for everybody to register, to create an account, and to play around with the software. In case you tried that over the weekend and it did not work, then I have to apologize because there was an issue. There were security updates on the server, and that means the platform was not available over the weekend. So the way we would like to do this today is, first of all, I would like to remind everybody that I'm video recording this event. I would plan to put that then on the Reflect Georgia page so that other people who are interested can watch it later. I also would like to encourage everybody to interrupt the speaker with questions and comments. When you enter this, your mics are muted, so you need to unmute your microphone to say something. Right now, we are a rather small group, so it should be possible just to use mics and talk. If the group gets larger, then please use the chat function. So if you move your mouse, you see there's a window on the top right of the screen which says chat, and you can type something, and then we will read what you typed, and so that's another way to get this discussion. Good. So we titled this an online panel about problem-based distance learning with the Reflect platform. And that was, of course, motivated by the fact that we all now are teaching online, mostly forcefully, not voluntarily. But it turned out, according to my experience, that the Reflect platform is really an excellent tool that can be used in online contexts. And that's the reason why I thought I should use the opportunity and arrange this panel discussion. Let me say a few words about problem-based learning for those of you who are not really familiar with the concept. The main idea that small teams of students work independently on a problem. Now, research shows that if you do that, you should do it with facilitators. So somebody should sit close to the group and is observing and would be ready to jump in if there's need for support. And the facilitator usually is also necessary to observe group dynamics, because oftentimes there can be conflicts among team members, and that's an issue that needs to be observed. Now, the basic idea of the software tools that I developed here is that the facilitator can, to a certain degree, replaced by software, so that the guidance that a facilitator would provide is offered by the software, and the user guidance, which is really the critical feature of the Reflect platform. With regard to problems in group dynamics, something I would like to mention right away is that you should use other tools as well. With regard to group dynamics, I think it's crucial to have learning journals or something, so that you ask the students after each other, every other team meeting, to report whether there are any problems. I did that with great success, and over the years there were not many teams where a problem popped up, but if and when there were problems, it was significant, and it was really important to know about these problems early on so that you can intervene and talk to the students. Now, the main idea with regard to problem-based learning is that you really turn over the educational exercise to the students themselves. So they are working independently, and that means the role of the instructor is fundamentally changing, because out of a sudden you become somebody who will be approached by the students with questions instead of sitting in front of them and telling them something. So they are guided by the software. They encounter problems. It's all very unfamiliar for them, and they will come back to you and ask questions. And that really turns around the situation which is kind of nice. And that makes it also very attractive for online learning, because the teams that I'm using are about between 3 and 5 students strong. They can also be larger, but 4 students on average turned really out to be very effective. And this can very nicely be done by using video conferencing tools like BlueJeans or Zoom. So if you have a small team, it's very easy for them to communicate. So what I would normally do is when I'm teaching a class, so I taught a class with 30 students just this past semester, and these 30 students were divided into 7 groups. And we started the normal class meeting only 5 to 10 minutes, where I asked the students whether they have any questions. I introduced the next important steps and talked about some general ideas that are important for them to understand. But that was really only to provide an opportunity to them to ask any questions that they might have. So that was kind of 5, 10 minutes, 15 minutes class discussion via BlueJeans. And then they went into their subgroups and worked, guided by the Reflect platform, on their problem. And so I had a document open on which they would invite me to their team discussions, because it's kind of awkward if you cannot simply jump from team to team when they are talking and all of a sudden you are joining in. That is kind of awkward. So I was using this idea of letting them invite me, and then I looked at the material, and then I joined the team, and they were prepared for that. So that is the only thing that I would like to say with regard to problem-based learning. Research shows that it can be very effective. Now the thing is, the focus in that I'm on which my projects of problem-based learning are focusing are wicked problems. That means it's a very specific kind of problems, and it is kind of significant that my 2 co-hosts are Zach and Paul are both working in environmental philosophy or environmental politics or policy, because in this area, the notion of wicked problems is really well known. And Brian, who's joining us today, is certainly is a very significant influence in this field. So the notion of wicked problems, which has been developed by Rittel and Weber in a paper about 50 years ago, is well known in environmental philosophy and environmental policy, but also in many other areas. The way that I'm using it is mainly with regard to ethics education, and here work on emerging technologies and their societal implications. Now, the notion of wicked problem, as I define it, following Rittel and Weber roughly, so not precisely, is that I would say the most important characteristic for wicked problems is that they can be framed from a number of different perspectives, and that depending on who's looking at the problem looks different. So that's the main characteristic of a wicked problem, that it can be framed differently. And this has certain implication, which already Rittel and Weber analyzed. And the first implication is that it becomes very difficult to formulate the problem, because there's no agreement on how the problem should be formulated, what the question exactly is, and on which level of granularity a problem should be addressed. Another implication of this definition of wicked problems is that there cannot be a predefined set of possible solutions. If it depends on the framing of the problem, then the number of possible solutions depends on the number of frames that are active, and the more stakeholders you have, the higher the number of potential solutions would be. And then the third implication is, if you look at the solution, there's mostly disagreement about the standards that should be applied to assess the quality of possible solutions. So this is kind of my introductory speech, and at this point I would like to give it over to Zach and then Paul, so that they can self-introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their own experience with the Reflect platform.
Hey all, Zach Paiso here from University of Dayton. I will be pretty brief because the wicked problems literature is also the literature that I am hoping that the students can better comprehend through the structured activities facilitated by the Reflect platform. I use the Reflect platform in a 300 level environmental ethics course. but it's a little bit of an untraditional environmental ethics course, and so I thought I'd give a bit of context for that. We really eschew some of the meta-ethical or value theoretic debates that characterize the early field because it's largely a course taught to non-majors and students who are going to go into management contexts or environmental policy contexts. And so instead, I really try to equip the students with an expanding set of skills for making environmental decisions that are sensitive to a diversity of stakeholders. We kick off the course after some founding background using Brian's work and also Paul Thompson's notion of ethical inquiry. First, having the students think about interdisciplinary integration, where the model of that is doing a cost-benefit analysis, where they try to quantify, the environmental value or economic value of ecosystem services, to stakeholder analysis, which is our model practice for transdisciplinary engagement. I have found in teaching the course with non-majors that they really need a lot of structure to be able to deploy systematic methodologies for identifying the values that are at stake in a wicked problem and thinking about how they ought to weigh trade-offs in achieving that plurality of values. So we spent about a month on this transdisciplinary unit where we engage first case studies that I have selected, going through the Reflect platform where we spend each day doing the problem formulation stage, the stakeholder analysis stage, and then the synthesis proposal stage. I can share I think actually Michael may have uploaded the problem formulation that I use when we model it together, which is a case study of managing invasive water hyacinth in the Crystal River. Anyone's familiar with that case study in adaptive management. Once students feel familiar with this general approach and the ways that the problem itself is contested, or the problem formulation itself is contested, they author their own problem formulations, again in groups of about 4. The nice thing about the platform is that it is structured so that they have to work independently before coming together and working collaboratively through most of the stages of the platform. And I think that helps to build accountability within the group so that, with group work, you can always have some people become really fluent in the learning objectives or target skills, and other people feel a little intimidated by this or otherwise aren't as engaged. So that's a really nice feature of it. And I guess what I will say before turning it over to Paul is that the latitude that I give them in identifying an environmental challenge or wicked problem of interest to them, that by having the structure of the Reflect platform, I can give them a lot more latitude or liberty in the specific topics they want to explore that are of interest to them personally or professionally, and still kind of have them working, in a stream with everybody else on different stages where the class is kind of at the same step each class period as they work through this. And so we're able to do this entire module on transdisciplinarity over the course of about a month, starting from just basic concepts to modeling some case studies to having them come up with a synthesis proposal for a topic of their choosing. And the last thing I'll say before turning it over to Paul is my students were not required to use this technique when they tackled their final project or the topic for their final project. And across the board, everybody really wanted to kind of come up with their squiggle graphs and synthesis proposals and stakeholder analysis. So the fact that they themselves wanted to use that platform, I think, is a nice endorsement of the clarity it lends to the inquiry that they undergo.
Thank you, Zachary. Thank you, Michael. And can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to kind of think with you and talk about this platform. My name is Paul Hirsch, and I did my graduate work at Georgia Tech, so it's sort of nice to be back there, and virtually at least. And the class that I used it for, actually, I've been teaching online for 3 years, so maybe I was in the unique position when all this went down that I was doing what I was doing, and other people then had the opportunity to sort of figure out what I had taken 3 years to try to figure out, overnight. So it's been really fascinating to watch and to think about how a lot of the things that we do in the classroom work or don't, excuse me, work or don't work in the online space, or what you need to do to adapt them. So I was excited when Michael contacted me before my semester started to have the opportunity to play with this Reflect tool, because I've appreciated for a long time how Michael thinks very systematically, if you will, about wicked problems, about a very sort of unsystematic space. And the class that I specifically used it for was environmental, called Public Participation in Decision Making. And it was a graduate course, which is part of a 3-series of courses program I teach in environmental leadership, which is an online certificate. So this, in a sense, is kind of a capstone experience that I do, and I emphasize problem-based learning. And I've been doing it with groups of 3 to 5 and doing kind of the group project thing, and had some successes and some struggles. So I was excited to put it sort of in this template, if you will. And following Zachary, what I really appreciated about the Reflect platform was that process where first I had to do the work of formulating a problem to the degree of specificity or generality. And that was actually quite a lot of work. And I had to think a lot about that, which was appropriate, because then the students have to grapple with that. And then you're kind of doing the same work before they're doing it, and you're giving them the context within which they do it. I put a lot of effort into formulating a problem around high-level nuclear waste, and I posed the challenge of whether or not sort of a one centralized place versus multiple decentralized places, as a very general sort of thing, was maybe appropriate, and how they could think through the complex trade-offs of balancing those two kinds of choices. And I tried to frame it in an open-ended way where I said, you can attack this problem in any way that you think is helpful, and you're going to reformulate it in a way that you think can give us some insight, basically, into solving this problem of high-level nuclear waste and its impact either on specific communities and or on the national global context. So problem formulation part worked really well. I passed that off to them. They struggled in their groups. They had to first reformulate it individually and then reformulate collectively and agree on a shared problem formulation. And I thought that was excellent, the way that worked. And the problem I ran into, or maybe the limitation of sort of my own use with the Reflect platform, is that some of those problem formulations worked better than others for the next steps that the Reflect platform provided, which has to do with identifying different stakeholder perspectives and interests and so forth, and then trying to integrate them into a final proposal, a synthesis proposal. So for a couple of my groups, it worked quite well. They formulated a fairly clear problem that worked for that. Other groups wanted to tackle different aspects of the problem, like, for example, how do we assure authentic decision making when you have a disempowered community and maybe a company with more power? How do we create a process that honors both of these? And to me, that was a fair thing to tackle for this project, but didn't really fit well within how Reflect kind of unfolds. So at that point, I relaxed, the push or the mandate that they use Reflect, and those who were able to use it, and those who formulated the problem in a different way, I let them do something different. And what I learned from that, and what I would do again, or what I would sort of my advice to anybody thinking about using this platform is, at least for the first time, I think less might be more. One of the great things about Reflect is that you can create a work plan. And there's all these steps that you can do, and they've thought very carefully. I mean, it's very well thought out, not just sort of operationally, but the operations reflect, a strong philosophical approach to deal with wicked problems. And so I really appreciate that. But it's modular. So you can pick one piece of that or multiple pieces of that, whichever pieces of it work, and build the work plan up front. And I think that is key. And if I were to do it again, I would have a less ambitious work plan. I would probably focus on problem formulation and then maybe one or two other steps, or make them more optional. You can always add more. Sometimes that's better than trying to promise up about and then do less, like I ended up doing a little bit. Overall, though, I guess the last thing I'll say is just the appreciation for that way that the philosophical conception of dealing with wicked problems is sort of instantiated in this software. I think that's hard to find. I played around with a lot of software, and they do different things, but they don't necessarily, they're not the reflection of someone really thinking deeply of how you engage with wicked problems and then how you lead other people through this type of exercise. And by the way, I also learned that, I have my own pathway, if you will. I use Brian Norton's textbook in my class, actually, Sustainable Change. And Brian has a philosophy that I think is very much in the same family as Michael's, but also has its own nuance. And then my philosophy or my approach is very much in the same family, but also with its own nuance. So one of the questions I'm dealing with now is how do I use a platform like Reflect, but also kind of make it more my flavor, if you will. And I think that's very possible and an exciting prospect. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul, and Zach as well. So this gives really some very interesting insights, and I would like to continue at this point with the following. So, I mean, the main function of this panel discussion is, first of all, to give you an introduction so that you can see what you can actually do with the Reflect platform. So I will start sharing my screen in a minute so that you can see how it looks from the inside and what can be done. So that's kind of the introductory part. And then the other part is really the question, what are the startup costs if you try to do that? I mean, we all developed our teaching styles. We are used to work in a certain environment and everything works fine. As Paul said, with regard to online learning, it takes 3 years to develop something that works. Now, the question is if you are, I mean, that's my intention is to convince you to try to work with the Reflect platform. But it's clear that there are costs involved because you need to establish new habits. You need to figure out how to do it and so that it works for your goals. So one of the functions of this discussion is really to get some more clarity what the startup costs actually are. I cannot tell you much about that because for me there were no startups costs, but certainly there's a situation that can provide more experience about that. Okay, there are two things that you need if you want to start. And at this point, I would like to share my screen so we can look at some stuff. The first one is, and Paul mentioned that already, you need a problem formulation. Now I have to, what I would like to show you now is, that's kind of crazy. I need to move. What I would like to show you is, so you need two things when you start. The first one is you need the problem. Paul talked about that by saying you need to formulate your own problem. If you are not interested in developing your own problems, you can use one of those that are already here publicly available on the website. So this is organized along these lines. So we have work on emerging technology with the projects here. There are political that we did, and then there are environmental problems. For example, the first ones are all the ones that SAC developed. And if you click on one of those, then you get a problem description, so in general terms. And as Paul said, that is really your way to introduce the students to something on which they are then supposed to work for some time. So you can at any time, this is Paul's problems here that he was mentioning with regard to nuclear waste. When you set up a class in Reflect, you would simply use this problem ID, and then the problem would pop up as for the students. And if you would like to develop your own problem, as Zach and Paul did, then you would simply send me an email and I upload it, and then it's also available for the students. So the first thing that you need is you need to have a problem, a general problem formulation. And the second thing is you need to make a decision which kind of work plan you would like to use. Now with regard to the work plan, so if you are on your account and you log off, what you then see is this list, and these are all the work plans that are currently available.
Michael, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Phil. I did look at those problems yesterday, and they're kind of like rather short, and they're all about the same length. I'm just wondering what your thinking was about kind of the length and the limited amount of detail, which of course there's always pros and cons on this, versus a much longer kind of case that has more nuances.
Yeah. My short answer to this question is it is really not that important, because more important is what the students are doing then when they try to formulate their own problem. So the problem, we call it the initial problem formulation. So the instructor develops an initial problem formulation, which is only used to determine the context or the boundaries that within which students are working, or which they are also invited to transgress, so they can think about other things as well. But it's kind of the starting point. If I look back at the history of my problems, they started shorter and then they become more longer and longer. For example, if you look at some of those, for example, this one about privacy and autonomy in social media. So that's a rather long one, and there are references, so you could click on this material and then you see the material that has been used. So it's up to you. And I also worked with a colleague of mine who did not formulate any problem description, only a title, right? So there was just a title, and that was the starting point that he was using. Phil, does that answer your question, or did I miss something?
No, good answer. Of course, I'm intrigued, and I'll let you kind of continue as to see how this unwraps.
Yeah, okay. So let's have a look. So as I said, when you're logging out of the platform, you see this list of work plans. And I would like to show you the one that SAC was using and the one that I also use, because then you will see exactly what Paul was talking about, because the plan that SAC used is designed for a project that takes about 5 team meetings. Let me just show you that. So yeah, so this is number 13, work plan for about 5 team meetings. And the one that Paul was using is our most comprehensive one. That is designed for projects that can last up to 14 weeks or 14 team meetings. So, and I will first, because if I open this one, you will be overwhelmed probably. So I show you first the shorter one for 5 meetings. So what you see, this is not what the students are seeing. That's kind of only what you will see when you prepare this. So it starts with individual preparation. So the student, it works for the student just as it works for us now. So you click on first individual preparation, and then it says in the first subtopic, do research on the wicked problem. And if you do that, so there are instructions that tell people they need to go to the knowledge base. I will show you the knowledge base later, in which they enter material and short descriptions about what they read. Then they're individually invited to provide the stakeholder analysis. So the point is, there are links in this work plan, but they are not usable because you are locked out. So this is only for preparation. I will show you later how it looks when you're inside. So an individual stakeholder analysis with instructions, and then the task, consider the question on which level the problem should be addressed. So the students got the general problem formulation, and now they are challenged to think about whether my problem formulation addresses the problem on the right level. So it may be that they would say that we are focusing only on the sub-problem within the broader problem, or they would say, no, we need to focus completely differently. We need to address this in a much more general way. Question on which level the problem should be addressed. It is important that your team addresses the problem on the right level. Click here and provide your suggestion on how the problem should be described. Note, this page is a team page, so that you will see the entries of all team members. The individual stakeholder analysis is not a team page, that's individual. Okay, now, so this is individual preparation. The next step is then the first team meeting. So this is first team meeting, second, third, and fourth, you could say. However, you need more for this, for each of the steps. So overall, it's about 5 meetings, but you can also stretch it if you think it's too stressful. I wouldn't do it in 4 meetings, but these are the 4 topics. So the first one is, so the team gets together, and then their task is go to the problem formulation page, follow the instructions there. Okay, we will see how that looks later. The next is also a team task. Develop a stakeholder analysis in your team, which is Yeah, so that's, I will show you that later. The next step is what we call a synthesis proposal. So the idea, the principal idea, and this is well visible in this work plan, the principal idea is that there are really 4 steps. The first one is a problem formulation. The next step is a stakeholder analysis. So within this problem, who are the stakeholders? Who are affected by any decision and who have a stake in the decision making or in the decision? And this will then be clarified in a stakeholder analysis. And then the next step after problem formulation and stakeholder analysis is the synthesis proposal. And that's the first step when users are really invited to think on their own how they would resolve the problem based on their problem formulation and based on their previous stakeholder analysis. So the idea here is, I mean, if I give you a problem, it's immediately that a solution pops up in your mind. So we are all kind of trained to come up very quickly with solutions. This is interrupted here. So the idea is really step back, do not think about your own solution, but think about who are the stakeholders, what's the problem, and only after this analysis has been completed, think about what should be done to solve the problem. And then the last step here is a project presentation. So this is a rather short work plan. I have to tell you that each of these work plans is accompanied with an instructor version of the work plan. For example, so we looked at work plan for about 5 meetings. The instructor version looks like this. So it is exactly the same work plan. So you see the first individual preparation. It's the same thing that the students see, but then you have your own tasks. This one says, for example, approve individual stakeholder, but it also provides criteria. So in this case, it says assess only completeness. The only function of this homework assignment is that students come well prepared to their teamwork on the problem. Content-related comments are better provided to the teams, not to individual students. And that's also the reason why there's no feedback or no grading or feedback to the stakeholder, to the individual stakeholder analysis. But after the teams talked about the problem, you as instructor find the following here: finalize the problem formulation with each team. So this partly takes a long time. So this instructions, you also see criteria. So it's kind of, this is based on my experience and things that can go wrong. And Paul mentioned that already, that students come up with very different kinds of problem formulations, and some simply do not work for the further progression of the project. So at this point, it is really important that you work with each team so that they get the problem formulation to a point that makes sense. Of course, I mean, the thing that Paul was mentioning, and that is really an interesting and important discussion, is at some point you would like to give more leeway to the student teams, and then it may be useful not to continue working with the Reflect platform, but using something else. And that's something that I was discussing both with Paul and Zach, is the possibility that we develop together work plans for the future. So these are the ones that are developed right now, but there's no reason to limit that, and that would really be interesting to develop more work plans which fit to very different approaches. So this is the instructor work plan, which provides a lot of detail for how you should work with the students. Okay, now let's look at the first one and most comprehensive one that we developed. And you can already see that this is more stuff. In this case, it starts with a team meeting. So there's a first team meeting, which is, so it's talking about that the team needs laptops and place. But then there's also a trust building exercise. So they should introduce themselves. Then there's something about team rules, commitments, and there's a page on which they would enter team rules. And then it says familiarize yourself with the problem, which simply means they look at the problem formulation that the instructor provided and talk about it. And after this first team meeting, then they do the same thing that was also in the other work plan. The same thing is basically about the same. However, there's a presentation after the stakeholder analysis. And if you read the instructions, it says, so the presentation should be about the problem formulation and the stakeholder they identified and the stakeholder analysis. So that's kind of interesting, because then teams who are working on a similar problem see what the others are doing and it also is a good opportunity to criticizing or providing further input to the work of the students. And then another important distinction is there is a reflection on team dynamics. This has been developed by colleagues at Georgia Tech. It's called an honest conversation. Now, this is very short. It only describes the problem. On the instructor page, there's a lot of material that you can download directly from there that helps you to organize this reflection on team dynamics. These are 2 exercises, and each of them, they take together about 45 minutes. Then they would also work on the synthesis proposal. Another additional step is working on a justification. So each component of the synthesis proposal should be justified. We are using argument mapping for that, and that is described here. So so that's the one that I developed. I used it all the semesters I taught with the platform, besides the last semester this spring. I thought maybe I should try what SAC did, maybe starting with the smaller one, and that turned out pretty well. But these are the options, and as you can see in my list of work plans, there are more. One thing that's very different is this is a work plan for stakeholder deliberation. So that is if you're in a professional setting, we did this. We had a deliberation about the Confederate memorials with stakeholders who tried to develop a solution with this a memorial on Stone Mountain here close to Atlanta, which was really interesting. I wrote a paper about that, which is not yet published. And another one, which is also interesting, is a work plan that has been designed for developing an interdisciplinary research proposal. Now, this looks like this. So it's focusing on teams who develop research proposals. I mean, Chris, you remember what we did with Ashok Goyal on this artificial intelligence project. So a software like this one could be used to support the development of such a proposal. Okay, so that's what I wanted to tell you about the work plans. So as I said, you need to come up with the problem formulation, and you need to come up with a work plan selection. Good. So now let's have a look into this. And but before I do that, maybe somebody has any questions. Are there any questions? Maybe I should give you some pause. And then I would like to talk about the learning goals before I show you the platform, if that's fine with you. But are there any questions that you would like to ask right now? Okay, then let me continue.
Michael, you might be, so again, you might do this. Do you have any examples of the final products that students have put together, their projects?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's so I would like to talk a little bit about the learning goals, and then I would like to show you one project so that you can see the entire process, or at least briefly what they accomplished and what they did. Okay. So this is also here. No, it's here for instructors. Sorry about learning goals. So the main thing is these are the topics. So with regard to wicked problems, they are supposed to learn about problem framing, stakeholder analysis, proposal development, and argument mapping. I have to say, and you saw that already in the work plans, what kind of learning goals you will be able to achieve depends on your selection in the work plan. So that's the most comprehensive list. Now, with regard to skills, so from an ethical point of view, it is crucial to become aware that decisions are having ethical components, especially if it comes about identifying stakeholders. So taking into account those who are affected by a decision, that is a crucial ethical challenge. Now, the next point is understanding what wicked problems are, why wicked problems often cannot be resolved, and how wicked problems should be approached. For that, the guidance is designed. Now, this is something to show in some more detail. So when it comes to problem framing, so being able to determine the boundary between problem and context. So if you think about this, this picture in the top left corner, let's say this is your problem space, and each of the circles, so the red circle, the yellow, and the blue circle, could describe different ways to determine the boundary between problem and context. So that is crucial for problem framing. And the second point that's crucial is to interpret what is inside of these boundaries and what, so the interpretation of what you think is within the boundaries of the problem. Then stakeholder analysis is about identifying relevant stakeholders, understanding their perspectives, identifying their values and interests, and understanding conflicts among them. The goal with regard to the proposal development is to develop the ability to create a consensus proposal that can be accepted by all stakeholders. So the goal is really that they work and work as long as it takes, that the stakeholders are satisfied. And then engage in deliberation in which claims are supported by reasons. Then there's work on argument mapping. Then there's skills related to teams, determine team rules, monitor progress, and then also the integration of different types of knowledge. So you have a team, the knowledge that is relevant or present in the team needs to be integrated. And then there's a reason why the platform is called reflection, because one of the most important abilities is to reflect critically on representations of your own reasoning. So that goes back to the Peircean notion of diagrammatic reasoning. Identify weaknesses in your reasoning and improve your reasoning. And all this is supposed to be done by reflection. So this is about the learning goals. Now let's have a look inside. I would like to, so this is it's your account page. If you're in, that's what you see first. You have to refresh your browser after logging in for the first time. Now let's look at this team here, which I guess I have to refresh it now. Okay, so this is the team page. You have, in this case, what pops up here is not the initial problem formulation, but that the teams created, because that's what's guiding their work. Now you see here, that's the work plan. For example, if we look at this one, find an agreement on the problem formulation, that's already what I showed you. Go to the problem formulation page and follow the instructions. And if you do that, then we see on top the assigned problem, then there are instructions, and then the students would work on realizing these instructions. I don't show you the bottom half because that reveals the student identities. For all the work that I'm showing here, I have consensus or agreement or permission from the students that I can use the material, but I don't show their names. Okay, so yeah, let me show you the first result of the stakeholder analysis. So if you go here over there, stakeholder analysis, let's read the problem. So that is what the student team came up with. This is about AI that counters human bias. I read it. Under pressure to reduce costs and decrease crime rates, law enforcement agencies have turned to AI and automation. Police departments employ predictive policing algorithms based on the times, locations, and nature of past crimes to provide insight to police strategies concerning where, at what times, police patrols should patrol in order to make the best use of resources or to have the greatest chance of preventing future crimes. It is currently unclear whether the technology in fact improve public safety or if they contribute to existing inequities. Much of the software is proprietary, so there's little transparency around how the algorithms function. The computer programs need large comprehensive data sets to make accurate calculations, but what determines which factors are relevant? What if the previous data itself encourages confirmation bias? How can these algorithms be written to reduce racial and socioeconomic bias and targeting while still being effective in preventing crime? Our team, so that's kind of a general problem description, and now they are required to think about their own team situation. So they write, our team is a task force in a large corporation that plans to invest heavily in the research and development of AI and policing algorithms that counter human biases. The company is concerned about its reputation and wants to move forward in a way that takes critical concerns into account. Our team is charged with creating an AI that mitigates these issues and has internal processes not dependent upon human biases in order to create an ethically sound tool. What design guidelines should it follow? Are there operational guidelines to consider for its use to still be ethical? How will we design the technology to balance stakeholder interests? And so on this side, you see on the right side the problem formulation, and then you see the stakeholders that this team thought is relevant. So stakeholders are law enforcement, computer programmers, innocent civilians, criminals, and companies. Of course, that can be done differently, but that's the way they did it. Now, when you look at this, so in order to see how they created this is a visualization in which they developed the stakeholder analysis. On top you find definitions and instructions. So you click on the question mark, it defines stakeholders, and then it tells you what to do. In this case, the main idea is to start with the identification of stakeholders, then determine for each stakeholder proposals. So what would a stakeholder propose to solve the problem? Then provide reasons. Why do you think the stakeholders propose what they're proposing? And then think about the reasons and try to abstract from the reasons interests and values. And let's have a look how they did it. So with regard to law enforcement, the proposal would be the technology should remain opaque and secret in its analysis process. The reason is, if criminals know how police are predicting their crimes, they will know how to avoid being detected by the AI. And interests and values here are safety of employees, decreased crime rate in the city, and so on. And you see, that's kind of the entire stakeholder analysis. There is lots of material that the students developed over some time and then presented. Okay, so that is the stakeholder analysis. There's another visualization which is important, and that is an interest map. So based on the stakeholder analysis, you can show again a page in which you have the problem formulation on the right side, and then a list of all the interests which are pulled, like the stakeholders earlier, from the stakeholder analysis. So because in the process they are working first, so they get instructions to work on the visualization, they develop all this, and then the data are pulled for these lists so that you can see what kind of interests they came up with. Okay. This is important because when they're working on their synthesis proposal, the main goal is to satisfy the stakeholders, and that means to satisfy the stakeholders' interests and values. So that is the idea, and if they continue doing that, they would then work on a synthesis proposal, and I show you just now what this team developed. So it's again the same problem formulation. The layout is a little bit different, but let's read now the synthesis proposal that they proposed. Police should release the types of information used in the algorithm's decision-making process so that the public is informed on how their information is being used. There should be an independent advisory board or advisory council that evaluates the algorithm before it is put into use. The council should make sure that it reaches certain performance standards and that the assumptions used by the algorithm for projections are legitimate for them. There should be an independent advisory council to evaluate, an independent advisory council, that's a different one, to evaluate the technology's impact on the community after deployment. The council should point out over-policing of certain areas and areas where there should be more policing. The council should be made up of prominent community members from each district, representative and a member of the local judicial system. The council should advise the local government officials who have the authority to change the implementation of the technology. The company should not retain sensitive crime data on servers owned by a third party. Data needs to be backed up by the city, not private companies. Algorithms, and that's the last point, should not factor in non-public information, such as using education levels to create maps of areas with a low percentage of college graduates. It should also not factor in domestic abuse cases into its decision making. So that's all that I wanted to show you as an exemplary project. I cannot show you the justification because that would reveal the names of the students, but all these components were justified by argument maps. Okay, so that's really the main thing that I wanted to tell you. Maybe I open it up at this point for questions you might have. Also questions for a second, Paul. So what do you think?
Hi, this is Bethany from Michigan State. Thank you, Michael and Zach and Paul, for your introduction. Very hands-on, very helpful in understanding how this actually works and could work in a classroom or a professional setting. As a scholar of integration, I'm very interested in the synthesis proposal and know that, of course, getting down to those brass tacks, trying to satisfy everyone's interests is very difficult. What kinds of coaching or activities have you instructors used to baby step or scaffold students through that synthesis process?
Yeah. Let me just show you one thing and then I leave it up to Zach and Paul. So I share again my screen. So the thing is, we have here a page so there are certain how-to pages which are also accessible from within the software. How to develop a synthesis proposal. So these are texts, and this is composed from a lot of literature, and it distinguishes 5 strategies. So this is getting to yes, focus on interests of the stakeholders, not their proposals. That's very well-known work in conflict management. Reframe stakeholder interests, invent options for mutual gain, think about so that's one of the things that I use mostly, So they when they work on the platform, let me show that as well. So there's one step in the creation of a synthesis proposal. Determine how much the stakeholders like or dislike the proposal. So that's a weighting table. So you see here the synthesis proposal, and then you see all the stakeholders, and the students have to think about what would a programmer say about this proposal. So the programmer would say, I don't care. So it's 0, doesn't matter. Law enforcement would be 1 in favor. Criminals would be -3, they don't like it at all. The others are all positive, Now, that these are all positive is a result of, so they need to do that recursively, So they develop the proposal, they do the weighting, and if weights are negative, then they either need to provide a justification. For example, in this case, they provide a justification why to exclude criminals based on a common good argument. But then there are still the other stakeholders which need to be positive. And if they're negative, then it's often about exchanging, compensating them and so on. Okay, so that's what they get, and they're supposed to read that in advance. And these are also the things that I would use in communication with them. But a second, Paul, I know that Paul's work on trade-offs, Paul can take 4 hours about that, but let's listen what he has to say. Paul, are you still there?
I'm still here. Yeah, I was getting off mute. Well, I think this is one of the most interesting parts. You say you're a scholar of integration, so it sounds like we could talk for hours about all that, and we probably should. We all should, because in my view, I struggle with this, right? I don't know that I really think a synthesis proposal is the appropriate goal in all wicked problem contexts because of issues like power, because of the wickedness of the wickedness, and it's not just that they're framed differently, but people have a different say in how it gets framed depending on where they are in the situation. So I guess it's one reason I would have a slightly different work plan. What I've been exploring is, and what I did explore with my students is, how can we articulate principles, which are different than interests? Principles are sort of public goods, if you will, at different scales. How can we articulate principles and then formulate a solution that meets those principles? That doesn't mean all the stakeholders will be happy. That doesn't mean all the interests will be met. It means we have a principle-based solution that we can take a stand for and adapt. And I would then say it's okay to have minuses, not just for criminals. Who's a criminal? Who gets to say who's a criminal, first of all? But for others, there will be complex trade-offs, there will be losses, and the best we can do is sort of acknowledge and grieve those losses, and we can't compensate for them all. So I don't know that answers how you use the Reflect platform, but I think it gets at sort of, when you get into this, it's fascinating, and it's a great discussion, and how much can we formalize it in these kind of, software tools, And then how do we keep things open so that we're not overly prescribing things which look good but aren't, appropriate? I very much appreciate being part of this discussion. What do you think?
Zach, would you like to say something about it before I give it back to Bethany?
I'll just chime in very quickly. Yeah, I mean, I'm operating in a context of a Catholic school with a ton of applied ethics or practical ethics programs. And so the pedagogy that's traditionally used in these courses is to sort of present both sides of an issue and have the students choose whichever moral theory best aligns with the side that they, right? So like I in that context, this simple learning objective of thinking through the challenge from multiple perspectives, focusing on actions that are minimally acceptable to most parties, and then, as Paul said, just being reflexive about the harms and losses that are and costs that are falling on some people, and to take responsibility by recognizing that, right? So even in cases where you're not going to reach consensus, the platform walks the students through the task of identifying who would be unhappy with the synthesis proposal and having to defend why they decided to weigh the trade-offs the way that they did. And for me, I'm just happy that the students have to own that and take responsibility for that and reflect on that, because I do think it's just sort of part of the wickedness of wicked problems. I thought that was well put.
Michael, I do have a question.
Please go ahead, Michael.
So as an NSF project, what sort of research are you doing to evaluate it?
Yeah, I mean, we developed a tool that tries to assess self-correcting reasoning. I mean, the platform is called Reflect, so we try to measure whether there's any effect on students' ability to be more reflective with regard to what they're doing. And the instrument is designed along the lines of the approach. But it's very difficult, and I mean, we will talk about that when we talk about the NSF project. It's very difficult to find any effect. So the tool really measures transfer, and to be honest, we did not see much of an effect. And since this was the only tool that we used to assess what we are doing, there are two components to the NSF project, but this is the only one that is directly connected to the Reflect platform. The other component is assessing whether different argument visualization tools have different effects on the quality of arguments. That refers only to the part that I did not talk about, namely the justification. And with regard to this part, we do not have results yet. So that's kind of, yeah. Michael, I saw that you also have another question that you put into the chat, because I would like to say something about that. So you wrote, does that mean that the platform could be used for 1 to 2 class sessions initially? Now, the thing is, and that is an idea that Zach came up with. So he was thinking, before students work independently on a project over 5 meetings, it might be better to walk them through a project over 1 or 2 class meetings. And he did that, and I did that as well. But we did not let the students work on their own. That cannot be done. It's simply too much, right? I mean, you could isolate, for example, only the problem formulation. Then you do it as Paul was suggesting, taking just a part and having 1 or 2 sessions of a problem formulation. That would work, but more work would not work out. So, and the work through, according to my experience, I mean, it gives the students a sense of how the platform is working, but when they then work independently, you really see that they did not really understand what the challenges are. So they need to work independently to really see what's going on. Chris, thanks a lot for your comment. You wrote that you have to go. Thank you in the chat. Okay. I mean, we said that it should be 1 hour, but if you have more questions, there's no reason to stop this right now. So please let us know if you have further questions. Yeah, so then I can only hope that you benefited a little bit from it and that it was interesting. So one thing that I would like to remind you at the end is there is on the homepage, there's a communication button where you can sign up for an email list. So if you like to be involved further on, it would be nice to sign up for this email list. Otherwise, we will post, as I said in the beginning, this video on Reflect Georgia Tech EDU. There's a group of videos and we will publish it there. Please feel free to talk to others about this approach and help us to promote it. Yeah, are there any final comments or questions that anybody would like to make? Then thank you very much and all have a good time and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome.